The beginnings of the French-Algerian War and the Vietnam Wars, the First Indochina War of 1946 and the Second Indochina War of 1955, are undoubtedly similar in many ways. Firstly, their beginnings took root in resentment for French colonization. Both Algerian and Vietnam were French-occupied territories, and desire for self-governing that led to independence was similar for both nations. The fact that both countries were ruled over by France and released around the same time may show a deeper trend in the 20th century, as during this time the First and Second World War highlighted European nations' bias towards imperialism, as they would allow only for European nations to take control of non-European nations. Secondly, both Algeria and Vietnam formed political parties at the beginning of their struggle for independence, Algeria with the National Liberation Front and Vietnam with the Viet Minh. Later, the North took on the name National Liberation Front in the Second Indochina War. The unity of these groups allocated for targeted and effective political and military action.
Before I even get into what I'm going to talk about, yes, I am fully aware that my video quality is not going to be as good as Natalie's from before and then Savannah and Adelaide's later. It's because my phone's out of storage, so I'm recording on my very poor quality laptop. So, I will be now talking about the differences and origins between the Algerian and Vietnam Wars. So, despite the similarities in origin, which was talked about in the clip before, both the Vietnam and Algerian wars have their differences aside. To summarize, the Algerian War was initially originated due to the complications between the French and the Algerians. When France took over Algeria, they divided the country into 3 different parts. Now, their takeover led to a bunch of racial disputes between the two sides, which is a primary origin of how the war started. Algeria's land ownership process was then repurposed by the French in favor of their preferences, which was another factor to the origin of this whole war. Yes, the French and Algerian war that we now know today, which the causes will later be further talked about in the video. And so, moving on about the Vietnam Wars, on the other hand, first and the second, both were primarily due to communism, something the Algerian War did not have to deal with. Well, after Japan had withdrawn from Vietnam, Ho Chi Minh declared Vietnamese independence. However, Chinese and British troops decided to just invade, which led to the French taking over the country. And they were mostly more anti-communistic. Yes. So the French attacked Haiphong and Hanoi, which caused an uprising of concerns and complications between both sides. Now, the Second Indochina War, infamously we know as the Vietnam War, was, of course, main problem was communism. North and South Vietnam were divided into 2 different sides of communism and anti-communism, South obviously being anti-communistic, and the North, we all know that they were clearly very communistic. Thank you, Ho Chi Minh. So the U.S. feared this communist belief would just spread across Southeast Asia, which would affect their relationship with certain Southeast Asian countries. And of course, they decided to step in. Did they have a need to step in? No. We know that it did not lead to anything positive for the US whatsoever, but they decided to come in anyways, which, again, main origin of the Second Indochina War. Yes. Moving on to Adelaide, she will be talking about some reason causes, and okay, bye.
Similarities and causes between the Vietnamese and Algerian independence movements. European imperialism affected both Vietnam and Algeria, leading up to their engagement in revolutionary freedom movements. France had vested interest in both Algeria and Vietnam, and in both instances, France viewed the people of those countries as lesser than themselves. Heightened French nationalism ensured that the Vietnamese and Algerians perceived the French as viewing them as lesser people, as children who needed educating. Both the Vietnamese and Algerians had a strong desire for a national identity free of the French interference. Both Algerian and Vietnamese citizens were put into positions lower than that of the French. They were left to partake in more agricultural jobs and without any real ability to stimulate their own economy. This left people impoverished and resourceless. Mass discontent and unfair treatment built the pillars of the revolutionary behavior by these colonized countries. Radical leaders were fundamental to the cause of the Algerian and the Vietnamese independence movements. Ho Chi Minh of the National Liberation Movement, or the Viet Cong, and the leaders of the Algerian FLN, or the National Liberation Front. Both movements were spearheaded by charismatic, English-educated freedom crusaders.
However, despite these similarities in the causes of both the Algerian War and the Vietnam War, there are important differences that clearly distinguish these wars, such as political ideology, leaders, and the racial and ethnic composition of the population. A considerable difference between the Algerian War and the Vietnam War is the distinction in political ideologies as a cause of each of the wars. Communism, to a great extent, was a cause of the Vietnam War, but this was not the case for the Algerian War. The Communist Party of Indochina was created in Vietnam to represent the working class and as a call to action for the Vietnamese people to reject French imperialism in Vietnam. Algeria did not rely on communism as a motivator or a call to action for the Algerians to oppose French imperialism in Algeria. Secondly, a significant distinction between the causes of the Algerian War and the Vietnam War is the influence of leaders on each of these independence movements. The Vietnam independence movement was largely characterized by Ho Chi Minh's role in it. He was a major leader in the Communist Party of Indochina and later came to be a leader in post-war Vietnam. Minh gave many speeches and inspired much of the working class to forge the way to ejecting French rule in Vietnam. On the other hand, Algeria did not have one specific leader that was the face or image of the movement, but rather many different leaders that made up the pyramid-type organization that the FLN relied on to remain safe from the French military. Lastly, another significant distinction in the causes of the Algerian War and the Vietnamese War is the racial and ethnic composition of the population on each country. In Vietnam, there was not an outstanding issue with racial and ethnic composition of the population because there were not many European Vietnamese encroaching on the Vietnamese people's life and livelihood. In Algeria, however, there were French Algerians and Muslim Algerians, and the racial and ethnic differences between these two groups created friction and conflict that eventually led to the outbreak of the Algerian War.
That concludes the end of this video. I hope you were informed and enlightened on this very interesting topic. Mr. Jennings, I hope you enjoyed the intro and the fun transitions and this outro. Haha.